The Kuta Sikha is Chelek Yud Zayin Behar Aleph. This is a Rashi Sikha, a little bit complex, but we will, as Hashem, go through it slowly, and we will enjoy it. This Rashi is going to be on the words. The Sikha is going to be on the Rashi of the word on the words Behar Sinai. Ma inyan Shmita Etzel Sinai, and is going to touch upon a machlokes of Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva with regards to where the details of the mitzvahs were given to Moshe Rabbeinu. Everyone agrees that klolos, the general principles of the mitzvah, were given on Har Sinai. But the question is going to be, what about the pratos of the mitzvahs, the details of the mitzvahs? According to Rabbi Shmuel, this was done only later on in the Oyel Moed, and according to Rabbi Akiva, this was also done b'Sinai. Also pratos of the mitzvahs were given in Sinai, Har Sinai, that is. And we're going to tie in this Rashi with that machlokes. So, join us. Page 276. In Aschalas HaSedre stellt sich Rashi auf die Werte Behar Sinai und is mefarish. In the beginning of this week's Sedre, the Rashi quotes the words Behar Sinai and explains like this: Ma'in Shmita Etzel Sinai. What's the connection between Shmita and Har Sinai? Why does Dafke by the mitzvah of Shmita does it say that Hashem spoke to Moshe Behar Sinai on Har Sinai? All the mitzvahs come from Sinai. So why Dafka by Shmita does he mention Har Sinai? Ella, and he answers the question: Ma Shmita nemru kol iseh uproteseh v'diktukeh miSinai. Just like Shmita, the basic principles of the mitzvah and the details of the mitzvah and the nuances of the mitzvah were all given from Sinai. Af kula nemru kol isehen v'diktukeh miSinai. So to all mitzvahs of the Torah were given both the general principles of the mitzvah and the details of the mitzvah were given from Sinai. Hados was steht ausdrücklich by Shmita. That which it says explicitly, ausdrücklich means explicitly, by Shmita, Azi is gesagt geworden by Har Sinai, Chach kol mitzvahs never mi Sinai. Even though all the mitzvahs were said in Sinai, nevertheless the Torah by Shmita tells us explicitly this was said in Sinai. It is kedei abzuleiten von ihr auf alle anderen mitzvahs. It's for the purpose of learning from Shmita for the other mitzvahs. As Punkt wie Shmita seinen Kloliseo, Pratiseo, V'diktukeo, Gezag Givarim Sinai, just like Shmita, all the details and all the smaller details, everything comes from Sinai. Azay Eich al mitzvahs, or so too all the other mitzvahs. Zainin Kloliseo, Nu Pratiseo, and V'diktukeo Misinai, the general principles of the mitzvah, the details of the mitzvah, and the details of the details, everything was given from Sinai. That's the first half of Rashi. The Nach sagt Rashi, then Rashi adds like this. This is how it's taught in Teras Kehanim. In other words, up until here, we were basically repeating what it says in Teras Kehanim. And to me it seems, says Rashi, that this is the meaning, this is the explanation of the Teras Kehanim. We don't find the mitzvah of Shemitah. Shmita's karkois, which means the mitzvah of not doing agricultural work in the 7th year. This is not mentioned in Chumash Devarim. We don't see it in Arvis Mayav. So from this we must deduce that the klolis and the pratos were in Sinai, because we don't see it mentioned in Arvis Mayav, in Devarim. So in that case, why does it have to say Behar Sinai if we already know that it was in Har Sinai, because it wasn't in Arvis Mayav? So therefore, we learn from this pasuk that all of the other sayings, all other teachings that were taught to Moshe, that everything, the klalos, the general principles and the details of all the other mitzvahs were also originally from Sinai. Then they were repeated in Arvis Mayav. This is the Rashi. Das heißt, Rashi comes to clarify as follows. That which we know that all the mitzvahs come from Sinai. We know that in the 40 days that Moshe went on to Har Sinai, the Eibishter was giving Moshe Rabbeinu all of the mitzvahs. We only know that he was giving him the general basics of all the mitzvahs. But the fact that the diktukeyan, the details of the mitzvah, were also given to Moshe Rabbeinu from Sinai, for that we would need a raya. Umen learn to sub from Shmita. The Raya is going to be from Shmita. Es ist aber kosche, was ist der Herrlich als Bar Sinai bei Shmita kommt anweisen auf die andere Mitzvahs. But how does the Behar Sinai of Shemitah teach me about the other mitzvahs? As ich dich zu kennen, seinem Sinai, es steht sich doch nur wegen Shemitah allein. If this is talking about Shemitah, so how do I know to compare Shemitah to the other mitzvahs, and also the other mitzvahs were Sinai? The Rebbe sagt Rashi. Therefore Rashi explains, since Shmitas Karkois is not mentioned in Mishnah Torah and Chumash Dvarim, wollt man euch on die Wörter Bar Sinai gewusst, as Protesea v'diktukea for Shmita never Sinai. If it's not in Dvarim, then where was it? Obviously it was in Sinai. So Shmita, I already know everything comes from, that everything with regards to Shmita, Dit, Klolos, and Protos, general and details, all come from Sinai. So then I can ask, why does it have to say Bar Sinai if I already know that everything, that even the details of Shemitah come from Sinai? Is there fun muchrich ados was ba kosev limit kan? So therefore, what is the Torah saying to me over here by Shemitah Bar Sinai? He says nit benegeat to Shemitah. As Shemitah is Sinai. It's not with regards to Shemitah, because that I already know automatically from the fact that Shemitah wasn't mentioned by Arvis Moyav, and therefore it must be that it originates from Sinai, even the Pratim. So I don't need to know Shemitah. So when it says Behar Sinai by Shemitah, nor Benegea called Dibur and Moshe, so it must be that it's teaching me with regards to all the other teachings that were given to Moshe. That even the details originate from Sinai, and that which they are mentioned in Dvarim is already a repetition of from when they were originally said in Sinai. This is the Rashi. In other words, Rashi is telling us that Shemitah, we know by itself, we know by ourselves that Shemitah, everything, Klolus and Pratus come from Sinai because we don't see it in Dvarim. So we know from there that it must be from Sinai. And therefore the question is, why does it say the words Behar Sinai if we already know that Shemitah was Behar Sinai? And therefore we arrive to the conclusion that the words Behar Sinai by Shemitah are not there with regards to Shemitah, but they are a teaching that could be learned with regards to other mitzvahs, that also by the other mitzvahs, just like Shemitah, Klolei and Upratei, and that also the details come from Sinai. That's the Rashi. Rashi brings the Teras Kehanim, says v'nidali shekach pirusha. Rashi has his way of explaining the Teras Kehanim, and this is what it was. So if we're learning this Rashi simply, and this is actually how some of the commentaries on Rashi learn this Rashi, we reach the following conclusion: two details. Aleph, Rashi Shaila is the Shaila from Teras Kehanim. The Rashi is bothered by the same question that bothers the Teras Kehanim. Zog der Pasuk by Shemitah as the Zog Bar Sinai. Why does the Pasuk say Behar Sinai by Shemitah? We already know that. We already know that it was Bar Sinai. And the answer, that it's not here for Shemitah, it's here to teach us about other things. Beis Rashi's teretz of the Shaila le'Teres Kehanim. The question is, as Behar Sinai lost herin, as alle mitzvahs seinen klolisei v'diktukei Sinai. That our Sinai is here to let me know that all mitzvahs, all 613 mitzvahs, both their general principles and their details come from Sinai. And this is here main sushelos and das Rabbi Shmuel. And this is here to negate the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, which I'll explain in a moment, as blaze klolus nemru b'Sinai, aber protus b'Ohel Moed, nor is kedas Rabbi Akiva as klolus uprotus nemru b'Sinai. The Gemara has a machlokes between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva with regards to this klolus and protus. Rabbi Shmuel says klolus nemru b'Har Sinai, that the general principles of all 613 mitzvahs were said in Har Sinai. Upratus nemru b'Ohel Moed, and the details were given over in Ohel Moed. That's the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva says klolus nemru b'Sinai. He agrees. Everyone agrees that the klolus comes from Sinai. But Rabbi Akiva says that pratus was nemru b'Sinai as well. Rabbi Akiva argues on Rabbi Shmuel and says even the protesein of the mitzvahs are also misinai. And according to Rabbi Akiva, he says in Oyel Moed they were repeated a second time, and in Arvis Moev and Chumash Dvarim it was repeated a third time. That's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So according to the Teras Kayanim, the pasuk here is a raya to Rabbi Akiva, that because it says Behar Sinai, we learn that just like by Shemitah, Kol Eiseyen Uprat Eiseyen came from Sinai, so to all the mitzvahs, Kol Eiseyen Uprat Eiseyen never be Sinai. And this way, it negates the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, who says that the pratis were erst said later on in Oyel Moed. This is the basic understanding of the Teras Kayanim. This is how Rashi understands. This is the basic understanding of Rashi, and many of the Mefarshei Rashi Taka explain it like this. Rashi is bothered by why does it say Behar Sinai by Shemitah, and Rashi's question is that Behar Sinai by Shemitah teaches me that all 613 mitzvahs, both Klaliseyan and Proteseyan, were said Misinai, and this is taking the opinion of Rabbi Akiva and negating the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Late them davon verstehen, but according to this, we're going to ask a series of questions. Number one, Aleph. Die bald Rashi Shaila ist first was steht Behar Sinai bei Shemitah, hat doch Rashi sich darstellen sich auf die Werte Behar Sinai, nicht auf die Werte Behar Sinai allein, nur meitig sein von der Parsha, ich werde was beweisen, ich Iker HaKushya auf Shemitah. If the question is not just about Behar Sinai, but about what's Behar Sinai doing by Shemitah, then Rashi's Dibra Maschel should have included not just the words Behar Sinai, but also Behar Sinai together with something about Shemitah. Von zweiten Pasuk was der against Shemitah, in the second Pasuk where it actually mentions Shemitah, or at least to add an etc. to the words Behar Sinai. The Shaila is doch nicht auf Behar Sinai, nor was die Werte stehen bei Shemitah. The question is not on the words Behar Sinai. The question is, why does it say Behar Sinai by Shemitah if we already know that Klolus Upratus of Shemitah was said by Sinai? So in that case, the question is on Shemitah. So it should have said either Behar Sinai v'goymer or Behar Sinai, and then mention a few words that it's from the next pasuk which say that we're talking about Shemitah. So that's question number one of a classic Rashi question, a classic question on Rashi with regards to Dibra Maschil, that l'cha'era, the Dibra Maschil is not accurate, seemingly, because he only talks about Behar Sinai and does not mention Shemitah at all in his Dibra Maschil. Question base. Question base and Gimel are both really a continuation one to the other. They're both really the same question, just on two parts in Rashi. Beis, Ibaldas, the Rov von Rashi is as the Pratim Nemer Behar Sinai. Unit Be'omek, das Rabbi Shmuel, if the Chiddush of Rashi is that the Pratim were said in Har Sinai and not Be'oyel Moed, like Rabbi Shmuel, is wie bringt die Rayas is gesagt geworden Behar Sinai. Von dem was leimat sinu chulu shenishnu Be'arves Moev, shenishnes Be'arves Moev. So why is he bringing a Raya that it was said in Har Sinai from the fact that it wasn't in Arvis Moev? It doesn't negate the fact that it was possibly said in Oyel Moed. And a gedar zagen lepachis leimatzinu chulushenishnes be'Oyel Moed u be'Arvis Moev. According to this understanding of Rashi is coming to negate the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel said that the klolus was said be Sinai and the pratis was in Oyel Moed, and we're saying no. Pratis was also said in Oyel Moed, in Sinai. So in that case, the fact that it wasn't said by Arvis Moev doesn't yet tell us that it wasn't said by Oyel Moed. How does the fact that it wasn't said by Arvis Moev prove against Rabbi Yishmael that it was said in Oyel Moed? At least Rashi should have said, we don't find anywhere that the mitzvah Shemitah was said be'Oyel Moed or be'Arvis Moev, and therefore it must have been Behar Sinai. But by not mentioning Oyel Moed, you're leaving an opening that it was be'Oyel Moed. Then how do you negate the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel? Gimel, al derech zeh, it's a similar to question base. Thus was Rashi is Messiah v'chazru v'nishnu b'Arvis Moev, when Rashi concludes that they were then later repeated in Arvis Moev. That first the Klalos Upratus were said Misinai, and then they were repeated in Arvis Moev. The Shaila is doch to the Pratim zayin gesagt geworden bis Sinai der be'Oyel Moed. If the discussion here is Rabbi Akiva versus Rabbi Shmuel, then the crux of the argument is, was it said bis Sinai or was it said in Oyel Moed? Arbis Moav is not even part of the argument. So if Rashi is taking the side of it about Kiva, then Rashi should have said they were said Behar Sinai, Klolos Upratus, and then they were repeated in Ayol Moed. Why does Rashi say Arbis Moav? In other words, both question Beis and Gimel are asking the same question, and that is Arbis Moav doesn't belong here. Arbis Moav is irrelevant, seemingly, to this Rashi, because the Machlokes here is either Sinai or El Moed. So both when he brings the raya that it was B'Sinai, bringing a raya from the fact that it doesn't exist in Arbis Moav is an incomplete raya, and also when he concludes that it was said by Arbis Moav is also irrelevant. It should have said and it was repeated in Ayol Moed, which is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva against Rabbi Shmuel. Daled, the fourth question, was is the arichus haloshen v'nida lishikach pirusha lefishalei matzinu v'chulu. Rashi says this is how it was taught in Teras Kenim, and to me it seems that this is the meaning. And he explains it's a very unusual lesson for Rashi. Bifrat, as it's not Rashi's inyan to befaras and Teras Kenim, specifically since it's not Rashi's role to be translating or explaining a Teras Kenim. So if he brings the Teras Kenim, why does he have to say v'nida lishikach pirusha? Muzman Zagin. So therefore we must say, as is done or to learn in an under period in Teras Kenim, that there is room to say a different explanation in Teras Kenim. Was dan volt Rashi need gebracht from Teras Kenim as ein pirush, and if that would be the case, in other words, if there was a different meaning to Teras Kenim, Rashi would not have brought that the Teras Kenim. But leidem pirush or the Teras Kenim kishaychas netzopsudah shomikra, because that other explanation would not be connected or not be relevant according to Psudah Shomikra. The Rebbe sagt, wenn nearly shekach pirusha was leit zayin pirush is the Teras Kenim negea to Psudah Shomikra. Therefore, Rashi has to bring his own explanation of the Teras Kenim, because only his explanation of the Teras Kenim fits in with Psudah Shomikra. Darf verstehen. So therefore, we must understand. Was is der pirush welcher man can learn in Teras Kenim? Was is nicht levi Psudah Shomikra? What is the other interpretation, the other understanding of Teras Kenim that would not be consistent with traditional Mikra? But then Pirush is Rashi Sheil, which Rashi has to negate that explanation. We'll learn in Teras Kenim Zayin Pirush and understand in the Teras Kenim his own Pirush. What's the first one? What's wrong with it? And what's Rashi learning? Gimel. See if Gimel is going to have two more questions, but these are not so much on the pshat as much as in the wording of Rashi. In Lashon Rashi umehem. Aleph betchilas dvarav sagt ma in yishmita etzel har Sinai. Aber der noch sagt gesehen dem Lashon mi Sinai on dem Wort har. In the first beginning of Rashi says the words ma in yishmita etzel har Sinai. What's the connection between Shmita and Har Sinai? But from that point and on in the Rashi continues to refer to Sinai as Sinai and not Har Sinai. He says, "Al lekol mitzvah mi Sinai, elamash Shmita nemru kol Yisrael, but it's v'diktukem mi Sinai, av kula nemru kol Yisrael, and v'diktukem mi Sinai." He doesn't anymore use the word Har. That's question number one. Base, question number two. When Rashi tied to his boa kosav limit kanal called dibur chulu shemisina hayukulam, and Rashi explains that because we don't find Shemitah mentioned in Arbis Moav, therefore from this we learn that so it can be talking about Shemitah. So it says by Har Sinai we learn for all the other mitzvahs that they are Misinai. Is there Moshe? Rashi adds the words after the words al kol dibur shenidbar leMoshe, any dibur that was spoken to Moshe. What's the chayda is as ayitur lashon. Seemingly, these two words are extra, superfluous. Ubifratas in Teras Kenim v'charashi kum mefares zayin v'nirli shekach pirusha shteit av kulo chulu, especially in Teras Kenim, which Rashi is explaining, as he just said the words v'nirli shekach pirusha. He's coming not just to introduce his own explanation, his own opinion, but he's coming to express his understanding of Teras Kenim. Teras Kenim says av kulo chulu and doesn't say shenidbar leMoshe. When it doesn't say Moshe, so why does Rashi add those two words? So very quickly, why does Rashi say Behar Sinai without any other indication that his question is about Shemitah? Number two, why does Rashi focus so much on Arbis Moav if seemingly the argument is between Sinai and Ayol Moed? Why does Rashi say V'nirlik shekach pirusha, implying that there's another pirush that Rashi is not understanding in Teras Kenim? What's that pirush and what's wrong with it? Why does Rashi say the words? Why does Rashi not use the word Har Sinai anymore after the first time it's mentioned in Rashi? And why does Rashi add the words Shenidbar leMoshe? Seif Dalet begins the beer, is the beer in Kol Anal, and this first paragraph is going to give us the nekuda of the entire explanation, and then we're going to have a few more seifim that are going to elaborate on understanding. But this next paragraph is the key. Rashi Shaila is nit was Behar Sinai steht bei Shmita. Now, Rashi's question is not why did it say Behar Sinai by Shmita, if we already know that Shmita is Behar Sinai. Nor the Verte Behar Sinai allein. Rashi is bothered by the words Behar Sinai. Noch eder mir wissen wegen was for a mitzvah der Retzach. Before we even know what mitzvah we're talking about, even if it wasn't Shemitah, whatever mitzvah would have been the mitzvah discussed here, Rashi would have asked this question: why is it say Behar Sinai? In other words, and that's why Rashi doesn't mention anything else in the Dibur HaMaschil, because his question is solely on the words Behar Sinai. Before we'll explain why he has a question, let's learn the brackets. Und das, was Rashi bringt, so if Rashi is not bothered by the juxtaposition of Har Sinai and Shemitah, why does he ask this question here? He says, der Fahr, was durch der Scheile vetirutz und Teras Kirnim, wird b'meile recht, because once we understand the Teras Kirnim, which explains the juxtaposition of Har Sinai and Shemitah, this will also explain Rashi's question, which is why does it say Behar Sinai? So that's why Rashi quotes those words. Similar to the Sheishas Yamim, where he asked Ma'in Shemitah Eitzel Me'ados, which was not Rashi's question, but by bringing that question in Emor Aleph. But by bringing that question, it answered Rashi's question, why it says Sheishas Yamim in the first place. This is a very similar structure. Rashi is bothered, according to the Rebbe, by the very words Behar Sinai. But by quoting the Teras Kohanim, will also, which asks its own question and answers an answer, that question and answer will also answer Rashi's question. And Rashi's question is, why does it even say the words Behar Sinai? Why not? What's Rashi's question? Funa kamas hamishkan on seinen alle die Burde Yashal Moshe gewendet Behar Sinai. Nor Bayil Mayid, from the point where the Yidden finished building the Mishkan, from that point and on, all of the communication of the Eibishter to Moshe Rabbeinu was not on Har Sinai, but rather it was in the Oyel Mayid. As Rashi himself said explicitly in Parshas Kisisa, Misha Hukam, from when the Mishkan was erected, Hashem does not speak to Moshe anymore from any other place other than the Oyel Mayid. Is wie kommt es, as nach allen Parshas Vesedris von Sefer Vayikra, was hebt sich an Vayikra Gomer my Oyel Mayid, steht bei Daber Gomer Behar Sinai. In Parshas Tamuruma, Tetzava, Kisisa, Yaakov Kudei, they're still building the Mishkan. So it would be understandable if it says Hashem spoke to Moshe Behar Sinai. But then they finished building the Mishkan, and then the very beginning of Parshas Vayikra is Vayikra Hashem al Moshe, Vayedaber elav mei Oyel Mayid, that he spoke to the Moshe Rabbeinu from the Oyel Mayid. And Rashi said in Parshas Kisisa, now from the point of the erection of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Mishkan, the Eibishter spoke to Moshe Oyel Mayid. So now it says, why is it Behar Sinai? Why all of a sudden is Hashem talking to Moshe Behar Sinai? It says 9 parshas later. That's Rashi's question. That's the Rebbe's explanation of what is Rashi's question. It doesn't matter what mitzvah it is. It could have been any other mitzvah. The question is, why all of a sudden are they communicating Behar Sinai? If the Oyel Mayid is already built, and we know for the last 9 parshas, Moshe has been said this. Eibishter has been speaking to Moshe Oyel Mayid. So we're going to suggest a couple of answers, and we're going to explain how they're not answers. As the parsha is gesagt geworden for alle Friedrich Sedris for Sefer Vayikra. Farah kamas Mishkan. We might be able to B'deicha Gadol. B'deicha Gadol means it's very difficult to say this, but we might very difficultly answer that really this was said earlier on. It was said before Vayikra. It was said before the Mishkan was built. Und das, was steht in unser Seder, and the fact that it shows up in our Seder, is because the Torah is not always written in chronological order. We just learned that Even Ezra, and this is actually how the Even Ezra learns on this parsha, that it was said much earlier, and it wasn't, and it's not brought into the Torah here, because sometimes not always is the Torah in the right order, in the right order of chronologically. There's Zobar Klal Nidglatik, but as we said, this is a very difficult thing to say. This is very not smooth. We only use this answer when we have no choice. We only say this, that this thing is out of order only when there's no choice. When there's darvs and episodes of them, and we have to find a reason why this is put in here and not there. So, which we don't have a reason. In other words, even if we say we say we have no choice, we still need a reason. So in other words, A, it has to be we have no choice, and B, there has to be an explanation for it. Oh, but Avifol season or Meglech. But whenever it's possible, we make every effort to study the Sedris and the Parashas in the right chronological order, especially when we're looking from the perspective of Psudei Shel Mikra, which is this simple understanding. Simply, if A comes before B, then it's because A comes before B, not because B came before A. So if we can, we want to say, we don't want to use the explanation A muktum mucher b'Torah. So why all of a sudden is Moshe talking to Hashem talking to Moshe Bar Sinai? Al derech hapshat is Eichsver to learn with the Ramban. The Ramban also has an answer, which is not going to work according to Pshat. The Ramban says, as a dibur Hashem al Moshe is Bar Sinai, that Hashem spoke to Moshe Bar Sinai. V'haratim gizdag the ganze parsha mit pratim, and he told Moshe Rabbeinu all the whole parsha of Shemitah and all the details. Und das, was die Parsha mit die Pratim, und das, was die Parsha steht dort nach Parshas Emer. And the fact that it's written here is as weil Moshe hat dem Zivui von Shemitah mit die Pratim übergegeben zu Eden erst demult nach der Meise ben Ishi Israelis. Because Moshe held on to this teaching for a while, and after Parshas Emer, the end of Parshas Emer, there's a story of a ben Ishi Israelis that cursed Hashem. And after that, and it happens to be that it was after that story, Moshe Rabbeinu told the Yidden the mitzvahs of Shemitah. That's the Ramban's explanation, that it was Taka said Behar Sinai. But even though we're already in an era, in a time period that everything's being taught by El Moed, it's because this was said much earlier, and Moshe doesn't say it until now. So it's in the right order in the Torah, but it's something that Moshe held on to for a while. So that it says it's also shver, it's also difficult. For from Pashtus Loshen v'Seder Aksuvim Kumtois, as der Vayedaber Avaya El Moshe is genoch the Friedrich Seder nach Parshas Emer. Here it doesn't say Vayemer Hashem El Moshe, Vayemer Moshe El Bnei Yisrael. I'm sorry. It says Vayedaber Hashem El Moshe, and it's where is it after Parshas Emer? So there's no indication other than the words Behar Sinai that this is out of order, or that Moshe held on to it and didn't teach it until later. So if you're looking from the perspective of Psudei Shel Mikra, it's very difficult to say that this came later on, that Moshe taught it later on, even though it was told to him earlier. And additionally, next paragraph, Gar Shverz Mefarezain as Moshe hat übergegeben Eden dem Dibur noch viele Chadashim sind hat es bekommen. It's very difficult to say that Moshe would hold on to a teaching and not convey it to the Yidden for such a long time. Is late Pirish Rashi freer as Anshe Yakosuf for Nitzagim Bismane, especially according to what Rashi tells us that Moshe was punished for holding on to something and not telling it right away. In other words, it's referring to the story when the Yidden discovered that they were getting 2 portions on Friday of the month. So the Nesiim went to Moshe Rabbeinu and they asked him, what's up with Mitamol? Why are we getting 2 portions? So Moshe tells them the whole thing of Shabbos. Cook everything today and bake everything today because tomorrow is Shabbos and there's not going to be any money. So from the fact that Moshe didn't go running to Hashem and asking him what's going on, it means that Moshe already knew about Shabbos. So Rashi says over there that Moshe already knew about it. It was already told to him, and he hadn't told it over to the Yidden. But later, when the Yidden made trouble with the mon, when they, I think, when they sprinkled it on Shabbos, Moshe says, or maybe it was something else, Hashem says to Moshe, Ad Masai mei antem. How long will you refuse? Including Moshe in it. This was Moshe's punishment. Since Moshe held on to a dibur and he didn't give it over to the Yidden until later, Moshe gets punished that he's also considered one of the mei antem, one of the people who were refusing to follow Hashem. So Moshe got punished for such a thing. So why do we think that Afal 1 second was Mekem Mechalek and even though you could say that over there he got punished because it was relevant, it had a practical application. They had to know about the Mon, they had to know about keeping Shabbos, and Shemitah over here is not yet practical because it wasn't the Geh until they came to Eretz Yisrael. So you could say it's not the same thing, but still, once Moshe sees how important it is to the Eibishter that he should give over the Diburim to the Yidden right away. To say that Moshe held on to it and didn't give it to the Yidden is very difficult to say. So that Ramban's answer doesn't either work. So we have a major question here, according to Rashi. Rashi's bothered. Why does it say the words Behar Sinai over here? Why is all of a sudden Hashem talking to Moshe Behar Sinai so long after the Mishkan was already built? The Rebbe learned Rashi. Therefore, Rashi has a revolutionary understanding of these words. As Parashas Behar is Taka Gezagevar and Lamesha Nach Demaisav Venish Yisraelis. That the Torah is in the right order. And Taka, after Parshas Emer, after the story of the Benish Yisraelis, that is when Hashem teaches Moshe the mitzvah of Shemitah. I was the state of Behar Sinai. So why did he say Behar Sinai? Why is he talking in Behar Sinai? He says, Mitzadem was Eden. Seinen Damos noch alles given by the Behar Sinai. It's because it means that he wasn't spoken to Moshe Behar Sinai. Har Sinai doesn't mean Har Sinai. It means because the Yidden were then still at the mountain. They were camped at the foot of Har Sinai. Fardim vayishub na Yisrael l'maseyim midbar Sinai, before what it says in Parshas Ba'aleischa that the Yidden traveled, they left the Masa, they left the encampment of Sinai, and they traveled on. Therefore, is Eicha Dibur was is gesagt geworden, Damos bei Omeid, sagt auf dem Vaydaber Behar Sinai. This is an incredible chiddush, that when it says Behar Sinai, it doesn't mean Behar Sinai. It can't mean Behar Sinai, because Misha Hukam Mishkan, everything is Bayil Moed. Behar Sinai means Midbar Sinai. It was Taka said Bayil Moed. And it calls it Behar Sinai because they were then in the Midbar Sinai. Ubefratas the Midbar werd gerufen b'shem Midbar Sinai al Shem Har Sinai, especially since the whole Midbar is called Sinai Desert, Midbar Sinai, because of the fact that the Har Sinai is in it. So therefore, when we say Har Sinai, we're not just referring to the mountain of Sinai, we're referring to the entire Midbar that was called Midbar Sinai because of Har Sinai. So that, in other words, what Rashi is telling us is that when the Torah says it does not mean that Hashem spoke to Moshe on Har Sinai in the 40 days or the 120 days that when Moshe was going up to Har Sinai, but it means that Hashem spoke to Moshe after Hukam Mishkan, after the story with Benisha Israelis, and the Taka was in the Oyel Moed, and the reason why he calls it Behar Sinai, because the Oyel Moed is in Midbar Sinai. Nor Azevi does Achilles to sagen, as mit Har Sinai meint man dem Oyel Moed. While is going to Midbar Sinai neged. But to say this by himself, or Rashi to just come and say Behar Sinai, Pirush, Midbar Sinai, Oyel Moed, this would be a huge chiddush. This would be an incredible paradigm shift of from where you're coming from, where the pasuk says Behar Sinai, to now say that Behar Sinai does not mean Behar Sinai, but Midbar Sinai. The Rebbe brings Rashi with Teras Kenim. This is why Rashi must bring the Teras Kenim. First, like Rashi's pshat in Teras Kenim, and then the way Rashi understands the Teras Kenim, as he says, that this is Rashi's version of the Teras Kenim, is Muchlechas Behar Sinai, Midbar Sinai. It will be a compelling proof that Behar Sinai means Midbar Sinai, Kidul Lekamon, as we're going to explain in the following Seifim. So, just we make sure we understand the Nekuda. Rashi's question, according to this new understanding, is why does it say Behar Sinai if everything that's being taught now is B'Oyel Moed? And the answer is that Behar Sinai means B'Oyel Moed and is called Sinai because it's in Midbar Sinai. Because the Oyel Moed was still in Midbar Sinai. And this is a huge chiddush to change that Behar Sinai means in Midbar Sinai. And therefore Rashi uses the Teras Kenim, the way he understands the Teras Kenim, to prove that Behar Sinai means Midbar Sinai, as we will explain in the following Seif. Seif Hey. The Teras Kenim sagt, Zifei, Teras Kenim says, as von dem, was steht, Behar Sinai bei Shmita, lernt man ab, as eich alle mitzvahs, nemnu, klali seim, du kemi Sinai. Teras Kenim says, that from the fact that it says, Behar Sinai by Shmita, we learn that all mitzvahs, their details, and not just the klalos, but also the details were said, Misinai, Varum, Vibaldas Behar Sinai by Shmita is kin chidush nisht, since the fact that the fact that it was taught Misinai, Behar Sinai, I'm sorry, is not a chiddush. Rashi is mefarish as eich on the Wörter Behar Sinai. Volt men gewusst lamadnus lekloliseo pratiseo kula nemra Misinai. Rashi says that we already know that. From the fact that it wasn't Behar Vismaya, we don't see Shemitah Behar Vismaya, we already know that by Shemitah, Kloliseha, Uprateseha were Misinai. Muzman Zagi, and das was steht da Behar Sinai, isn't this nicht zu dem Shemitah. So the fact that it says Behar Sinai can't be referring to Shemitah, because that we already know. So therefore, we could learn from these words Behar Sinai to all the other mitzvahs. Verwandt ist es, als they pashat bei Shemitah Atzma, wenn nicht die Werte Behar Sinai, as Klaliseo, Proteseo, Kula Nemer Misinai. From what is the source? What makes it so simple? Besides for the words Behar Sinai, that Klaliseo, Proteseo, Shemitah Misinai, is as totally in the pshat from Behar Sinai. This would depend on how you say the word, you translate Behar Sinai. Men learned as Behar Sinai meant often Bark Sinai. If Behar Sinai means the mountain, darf Behar Sinai stehen zu Shmita Atzma. Then Behar Sinai is needed for Shmita. For dem on Behar Sinai, wollt men der Fun, was die Parsha steht, lacher akamas amishkan, gelernt, as is gesagt worden bei Elmoed. If you're trying to prove to me that Behar Sinai, that Shmita was said on the mountain of Har Sinai, then I need the pasuk to tell it to me, because once the Mishkan was erected, everything was Ba'il Mayid. I would think that Shemitah was said Ba'il Mayid. Well, das was Leimat Sinu Chulish Nishus Barbas Mayav, and from the fact that it doesn't exist in Chumash Devarim, is nit kirayas. This is given Behar Sinai. There's no proof that it was on Har Sinai, because maybe it wasn't Ba'il Mayid Kinal Sif Beis, as was mentioned earlier in our questions. In question Beis, in Sif Beis, we asked, just because it was said in Arvis Mayav doesn't mean it wasn't said by Mayid. So just make sure you're following. If Behar Sinai has to mean on Har Sinai, the mountain of Sinai, then I have no raya that it was Behar Sinai. I don't know that Shemitah was Behar Sinai, if not for those two words. Because I know it wasn't in Dvarim, but it might have been Ba'il Mayid. I don't know that it was Behar Sinai. So then I would need to use the words Behar Sinai to teach me for Shemitah, that Shemitah was on Har Sinai. And then I wouldn't be able to use the Behar Sinai to apply it to the other mitzvahs. The Riber is Mukhrich. Therefore, since the Teras Koyanim is learning from Shemitah to the other mitzvahs that it was Behar Sinai, therefore it must be. It's clearly evident as latent Teras Koyanim made Behar Sinai Midbar Sinai. That Behar Sinai means the Midbar Sinai, the Eil Mayid. Und das, even the Eil Mayid. Und das, was Pratiseo von Shemitah gesagt geworden in Midbar Sinai. Zi Behar Sinai, zi Eil Mayid. Wollt men sei, wie gewusst, wenn steht in Behar Sinai, weil immer sehen, nu Shemitah sei koish nis Behar Mayav. So now we're broadening the space. Instead of having three spaces, saying either Har Sinai or Eil Mayid or Arvis Mayav, and then we're stuck because we know that it wasn't in Arvis Mayav, but we don't know if it was in Midbar Sinai or in Har Sinai. Now we're broadening Har Sinai to include both. It means either Har Sinai or Midbar Sinai, either Har Sinai or El Mayid. That's one category. Arvis Mayav is another category. Now we know it wasn't in Arvis Mayav. So if it wasn't in Arvis Mayav, then it was in Har Sinai, meaning either Har Sinai or Midbar Sinai, either Har Sinai or El Mayid. That I do know. So I have that information by Shemitah. Once you change the pshat of Har Sinai, then the Teras Koyanim makes sense. Since it wasn't in Arvis Mayav, therefore it must have been somewhere in Midbar Sinai, either on the Har or in the Eil Mayid. And therefore, I don't need any pasuk to tell me by Shemitah where it was, because I already know it automatically from the fact that it's not in Dvarim. Muzben Zagin, as die Werte Behar Sinai kommen lernen auf an andere mitzvahs, as euch sei seinen gesagt geworden mit Midbar Sinai as Shemitah. And then I could use the Behar Sinai to apply it to the other mitzvahs. So again, based on the way we're understanding the Teras Koyanim, that the Teras Koyanim is coming to tell me that the mitzvah of that is teaching me that the Behar Sinai is referring to other mitzvahs. The only way Behar Sinai becomes available to be applied to other mitzvahs is only if we tie Har Sinai to mean Midbar Sinai. And then in the brackets he has like this is very, very important. I don't know why it's in the brackets. Und das ist sei le das Rabbi Akiva. Sei le das Rabbi Shmuel. As die Proti HaMitzvah seinen gesagt geworden, nicht auf Har Sinai, nor be'oil Moed in Midbar Sinai. And now the Teras Koyanim is not siding with Rabbi Akiva against Rabbi Shmuel, which is what we thought in the beginning, that it's telling me that the Davke Behar, the Klolos Upratos were Behar, and not be'oil Moed like Rabbi Shmuel. No. Now Har means both. Either you could tie Har Sinai means Taka the Har, or you could tie Har Sinai means Midbar Sinai, and therefore the Teras Koyanim is not taking any sides. It could either be Das Rabbi Akiva or it could be Das Rabbi Shmuel. Both fit into the Teras Koyanim. That the chiddush of this pasuk is that the mitzvah, that all mitzvahs klolisei and upradesei nemru b'midbar Sinai, either in the Har or in Oil Moed. And not even those that were in Arvis. We'll get to Arvis maybe in a second. And therefore, since we don't need to tell it to us by Shemitah, because that we already know from the fact that it doesn't exist in Chumash Dvarim, so therefore we could use it for all the other mitzvahs. So now there's another change that the Teras Koyanim is not siding with Rabbi Akiva against Rabbi Shmuel. The Teras Koyanim could fit both according to Rabbi Akiva as well as according to Rabbi Shmuel. The Fiza, Sivav, as Behar Sinai made Midbar Sinai. If that's the case, we're continuing now. So we introduced the fact that Behar Sinai, according to the Teras Koyanim, must mean Midbar Sinai. So now, in that case, is was is that der uftu as kolesei no v'diktukein from all the mitzvahs and gezag gevarim Sinai. Then what is the novelty here? What is the chiddush that everything is Sinai? Was kumen the shelo sein, and not what? In other words, if there's an argument, if it was a Har Sinai or El Moed, I understand that according to the Akiva, it wasn't Har Sinai, not El Moed. But if when we say Har Sinai, we mean Midbar Sinai, then that all the mitzvahs were said in Koliseyan, Ubrateseyan, in Midbar Sinai, what are we negating? Zogt Rashi, so therefore Rashi comes to say, as ben kum da shelos ein arvis me'of. That we're negating Arvis Me'of as an mitzvah, as far as mitzvahs. There are certain mitzvahs that we find in Mishnah Torah in Chumash Dvarim, and we don't find them earlier on. I would think that even that those mitzvahs were introduced in Arvis Me'of, that the Eibusher told them to Moshe Ersht for the first time in Chumash Dvarim. Of them let it men up from Behar Sinai besteht bei Shemitah as echt die mitzvahs was nicht nur bei Arvis Me'of. That therefore what we're learning over here, that even those mitzvahs that were repeated in Arvis Me'of seien sie dort gesagt geworden nicht zum ersten Mal. Even those mitzvahs that we find in Arvis Me'of are not there we're not told for the first time in Arvis Me'of nor misinai ayukulam kolisei v'diktukei. They all originally come from Sinai, both the general parts and the details. Und das, was stehen in the Mishnah Torah, is weil Chazri v'nishnu b'Arvis Me'of. The fact that they're in Chumash Dvarim is because they were repeated in Arvis Me'of. And now we understand why Rashi talks about Arvis Me'of. The first time Rashi says that it wasn't in Arvis Me'of, because this is a raya that it was in Midbar Sinai, either the Har or the Oil Moed. And the fact that it says Chazri v'nishnu b'Arvis Me'of, because the chiddush of Rashi is with regards to those mitzvahs. The chiddush, according to Rashi, of Behar Sinai is with regards to those mitzvahs that are in Chumash Dvarim for the first time. And I wouldn't know, maybe they were said only in Dvarim. They were only told to Moshe Ersht at the end of the 40 years in Arvis Me'of. So Rashi says no, from the fact that it says Behar Sinai by Shemitah. Even though we already know that Shemitah was Kolisein or Protesein mi Midbar Sinai, this tells me that everything is in Midbar Sinai, and even those mitzvahs that are in Arvis Me'of are only Chazru v'nishnu b'Arvis Me'of, are only repeated in Arvis Me'of, but were originally told to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Midbar Sinai. Now we're going to answer the fourth question. So far we answered three questions. We answered why Rashi stells the Bahar Sinai, because that's what's bothering Rashi more than anything else. We also answered question Beis and Gimel why Rashi brings a Raya from Arbis Mayav, and why Rashi says Chazav Nishnu Arbis Mayav, because now that we've grouped together Har Sinai and Oil Moed to be one category of Midbar Sinai versus Arbis Mayav. Now Arbis Mayav is a good Raya. The fact that it's not an Arbis Mayav is a good Raya that it was somewhere in Midbar Sinai. And since Rashi is talking about those mitzvahs that were in Arbis Mayav, he says Chaz Nishnu Arbis Mayav. Now we go to our fourth question. Where Rashi asked, where the Rebbe asks, why does that say nearly shkach pirusha? What is Rashi negating? What understanding is Rashi negating that he has to say my pirush is the one that works in Teras Kehanim? When das is Rashi sagt nearly shkach pirusha, now we'll understand those words of Rashi. Der mit is a shelel, den pirush as die Pratim seine gesagt geworden zum ersten Mal Behar Sinai und nicht bei El Moed. Wie der pirush von Kamen Mefarshim, sei Mefarshim Teras Kehanim und sei Mefarshim Rashi. There are various commentaries on Teras Kehanim, as well as commentaries on Rashi, that do not take this approach that we've been learning for the last few Seifim, but they say that the Bahar Sinai is to teach me that the Klolos Upratos were Bahar Sinai in contrast to Ba'ayel Moed, like Rabbi Akiva versus Rabbi Shmuel. So Rashi is coming to tell me, when he says V'nirli Shekach Pirusha, that he's not following that Pirush. He's not coming to negate Oyel Moed and say that it was Davke Bahar Sinai, nor as bit Bahar Sinai kunter Sheils and Arbis Moyav. But that with Har Sinai he's negating Arbis Moyav. Rashi allein Taishtois, as Rashi himself spells it out, as mit Zayin Pirush is Mechadish, that his Pirush, V'nirli Shekach Pirusha, he is introducing this concept, L'fishalei Matzinu Chulu B'Arbis Moyav, Chulu V'chazru V'nishnu B'Arbis Moyav. We don't find it in Dvarim, and therefore we know that whatever is in Dvarim is a repetition of something that was already said in the Midbar. The fact that Rashi is dealing with Arbis Moyav it shows that he's negating Arbis Moyav. He's not negating Oyel Moed. And that's why he says the nearly shekach pirusha, because you would have read the Teras Kehanim, and you would have thought that the Teras Kehanim is coming to tell me Har Sinai in contrast to Oyel Moed, and this can't be. So now, if we follow the order here, Rashi asks a question: why does it say Bahar Sinai? And therefore Rashi says, from the fact that it says Bahar Sinai, it must mean that Har Sinai means Midbar Sinai. How do I know? Because the Teras Kehanim is learning that from Shemitah to all the other mitzvahs, that they were told Misinai, Kol Yisei and Uprot Yisei were Misinai. And if you're going to tell me Har Sinai, it's not going to work. Because what's the raya for Shemitah? That it was Bahar Sinai? There's no raya. The only raya is that it wasn't an Arbis Moyav. But if Har Sinai means Har Sinai, not Midbar Sinai, then I don't know whether it was Oyel Moed or not. And therefore, but since the Teras Kehanim is learning from Shemitah to all the other mitzvahs, that Mahalach, that Gaing, only works if Har Sinai means Midbar Sinai. And that's why Rashi's understanding of Teras Kehanim is that Teras Kehanim is coming to tell me Midbar Sinai in contrast to Arbis Moyav. And with that, we've answered all four questions that we had on Rashi, and we understand now that the Rashi is telling us a very, very different pshat than we would have thought going in. That we thought that Rashi is coming to tell me, that it was Dafke Bahar Sinai, Keshitas Rabbi Akiva. And now we understand that from the way Rashi quotes the words Bahar Sinai, and the way Rashi brings up Teras Kehanim, Rashi is telling us that we're learning from Shemitah to all the other mitzvahs that they were told Kol Yisei and Uprot and Midbar Sinai. We're not taking sides on the Har Sinai versus Oyel Moed, and therefore this could fit in Sai according to Rabbi Akiva and Sai according to Rabbi Yishmael. And now we have the two diyukim in Seif Gimel. We asked, why does Rashi not use the word Har Sinai, which was obvious now to understand, because he's not talking about Har Sinai, he's talking about Midbar Sinai, which he's going to say in a moment. And then he's going to address the Shanidbar LeMoshe. Seif Zayin. And according to all this, we'll also understand the diyukim in Rashi. Aleph, was sagt, Keseder Misinai, the fact that he's constantly using the word Misinai, you need Mehar Sinek Lashna Kosov, and not Mehar Sinek, which is just the Lashna Pasuk, and the word of, Rashi is more so he probably should have been using Lashon HaKosov, but it remains to Madgizain, because the reason why Rashi is using the word Misinai, because Rashi is coming to emphasize, as like Pshutei Shel Mikra, Veismen, Nora, das ist gesagt, Misinai, from Pshutei Shel Mikra, we can only know that it was Misinai, or the Rav and Har, and the Das Rabbi Akiva, or the Nidbar Sinai, the Nor Noel Mayed. Either it was on the Har according to Rabbi Akiva, or it was by El Mayed, but we don't know necessarily that it was Dafke Behar. So, but Rashi uses the word Misinai, which is more vague, because Rashi is not taking a position on the fact that it was Behar. Just the first time Rashi mentions it, and the Teres Kena mentions the word Har, because this question, what's the connection between Shemitah and Har Sinai, is on the pasuk. Well, the pasuk is Behar Sinai, and the pasuk uses the word Behar Sinai. The Rebbe is Behar Sinai, therefore, to introduce the question, he says, why is Har Sinai said by Shemitah? Because that's the pasuk says. But once he gets into the answer, he's telling us that we're learning from Shemitah to the other mitzvahs that they were said Misinai, and over there he doesn't mean Har Sinai anymore. He means Midbar Sinai, and therefore he doesn't use the word Har Sinai. When it comes to the second question we had, why does it say Moshe? Midem is there madgish as the chiddush from Teiras Kir Nimaskulu Nemer Misinai. Here Rashi is coming to emphasize that the chiddush of the Teiras Kir, that everything it was said Misinai, is benegea di mitzvahs as eine gesagt geworden ba'ar v'smoyav nor leMoshe. It's referring to the mitzvahs that were said in Arvis Moyav to Moshe. When the Rebbe is Rashi Moshe Shnidber LeMoshe. The Rebbe wegen die Mitzvahs, was der Dibber ist given nur zu Moshe und nicht zu Eden. Weil das, was Moshe gesagt mit Mishnah Teire zu Eden, ist es gewinnt Piatzmei. We should never Rashi Dibber Moshe b'Kol Yisrael and Arvis Moyav. So in Chumash Devarim, there are two sets of mitzvahs. There are two categories. There are mitzvahs that Moshe taught to the Eden. Those were Mipiatzmei. And those are not being addressed here at all. Which mitzvahs are we talking about? The mitzvahs which were nidber leMoshe. The mitzvahs that Hashem spoke to Moshe, which I might have thought that because Hashem is telling them to Moshe, they're being said here for the first time. And they said, no, they weren't said the first time, they were originally said in Midbar Sinai. In other words, the mitzvahs that were told to Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe is telling to the Yidden, for sure could have been told by Har Sinai. There's no reason to think otherwise. The mitzvahs that were nidber leMoshe, I might have thought that those mitzvahs were said here for the first time. And therefore he says that Shenidber LeMoshe. Now, why does he have to say the word Shenidber LeMoshe? Because once he's telling us that he's coming to negate Chumash Dvarim, if you look in the previous in Siv Vav, he says that Rashi is coming to tell us that the mitzvahs that were said in Arvis Moyav, that you might think that they were said for the first time in Arvis Moyav. So he comes to tell me that no, they were said first in Midbar Sinai. So if he didn't say Shenidber LeMoshe, I would have thought that he's talking about all mitzvahs. And for that, we don't need to be told about all the mitzvahs, because all the mitzvahs we already know. So therefore he says Shenidber LeMoshe, that in Chumash Dvarim, since there are mitzvahs that Moshe told the Yidden that were mipi atzmai, which means they was already told to them, they were already told in Midbar Sinai. So those for sure were said Sinai. But kol nidbar shenidbar LeMoshe, even the ones that are said now to Moshe, which to us seems like it's the first time, even they were said in Midbar Sinai first. Now, from what I understand, in the after or during, while the sikha was being prepared, the manichim, those who would prepare the sikhs for the Rebbe, add questions on this, and there's an answer from the Rebbe which is printed in Teiras Menachem, and he says like this. He says that maybe you would say that I would anyways know that Kol Dibur refers to Mishnah Torah. Why does Rashi have to say Shenidber LeMoshe? In other words, we just explained that he wants to emphasize that we're talking about Chumash Dvarim. Therefore he says, Kol Dibur Shenidber LeMoshe. Because in Chumash Dvarim there are Diburim that are from Moshe to Yidden. So since he wants to emphasize that we're talking about Chumash Dvarim, he says in Chumash Dvarim there are two types of mitzvahs. I'm talking about the ones that were told to Moshe. So he says, So he asks on that maybe that l'chayr you can ask called dibur because either way we're talking about chumash dvarim. So in other words, my initial understanding is that a thing that talking about chumash dvarim, he wants to say kol dibur shnei Moshe because there's two types. But whatever was being said to Moshe in that time is coming from Sinai. So why does it say shnei Moshe? So he says like this. He says, if he would have not said Shnei Moshe, then I would have thought that it's referring to the mitzvahs that are mentioned even not in Arvis Me'av. And I would think that, number one, those that were said in Arvis Me'av were also Protesei Sinai. And number two, that those mitzvahs that were said in Sinai were also repeated in Arvis Me'av. If Rashi didn't say the words called Dibur Shnidber LeMoshe, I would think that Rashi is telling me two things. Number one, that anything that is in Dvarim was originally said in Midbar Sinai, and anything that was said in Midbar Sinai was also said in Dvarim. Now, by saying the words called Dibur Shnidber LeMoshe, Rashi is emphasizing, I'm only talking about Chumash Dvarim. I'm not talking about the mitzvahs that were Nidbar LeMoshe Sinai. I'm only talking about Chumash Dvarim. That the mitzvahs that were said in Chumash Dvarim originated from Sinai. He's not coming to tell me that those that started in Sinai were also said in Chumash Dvarim. That's not Rashi's point here. Rashi's point is only to tell me that those mitzvahs that were in Chumash Dvarim were originated Kolesei and Protesei and Sinai. And that's what Rashi has to say Nidbar LeMoshe. And without going into these details, the reason b'chlal that it comes in is because before we were discussing Rashi's approach, if the Teres Kainim alone, that we're not talking about Arvis Me'av at all, we're talking about Har Sinai versus Oyel Moed, then the words Nidbar LeMoshe make no sense, because the words Nidbar LeMoshe only have implication when you talk about Chumash Dvarim, when there's other mitzvahs as well. So therefore, Teres Kainim doesn't say Shnei Moshe, because Teres Kainim, in other words, the Teres Kainim, without Rashi's version of it, is talking about Sinai versus Oyel Moed. But then, when it comes to Rashi's understanding of the Teres Kainim, which is that it's Midbar Sinai versus Dvarim, then you have to say Shnei Moshe to emphasize that we're talking about the mitzvahs that are in Chumash Dvarim. Sifches. Now, we've answered all of Rashi's questions. We now understand what Rashi is bothered by the words Behar Sinai, and Rashi brought in a new understanding that this is a debate between Arvis Me'av versus Midbar Sinai, and not a debate between Har Sinai versus Oyel Moed. And only the way the Rebbe explains that Rashi understands Teres Kainim does this answer Rashi's question, and does the whole flow make sense, and and therefore we now understand Rashi. But now we're going to take it a step or two further. Sivches. Now that we understand that now the way Rashi understands the Teres Kainim, it can work both according to Rabbi Akiva and both according to Rabbi Shmuel, is noch mer move on was is meisiv kach shnuya but Teres Kainim nilish kach pirusha. It's even more understood why Rashi says the word that this is how it's learned in Teres Kainim, and I believe that this is the pirush. Why? Because the Gemara sagt a klal Stam Sifra Rabbi Yehuda, v'kulu alibed Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara over there is saying that the various different medrashim, or according to who, if it's a Stam Sifra, if it doesn't say a name, who is it following? And he says the Stam Sifra is Rabbi Yehuda, and Stam this, I don't remember the other ones, but all of them, all the Stams, all the different ones, all follow Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was such a great Tana, Talmud Chacham, that all of these different Stam Mishnas or Stam Sifros all follow Rabbi Akiva. The Sifra is Teres Kainim. So how could you learn it according to Rabbi Shmuel if it followed Rabbi Akiva? If the Stam Sifra is Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda is following the Shittah of Rabbi Akiva, then how could you learn that's Rabbi Shmuel? Rabbi Akiva argued to Rabbi Shmuel. The Rebbe was Rashi Bavarin and Kach Shnu B'Teres Kainim. So Rashi is saying not only is Rashi changing the Pshat in Teres Kainim, he's actually adding another word. He's saying that the Teres Kainim thus is in Teres Kainim. Aber von deswegen kämen dann lernen, like traditional mikra, das geht nicht traditional. But nearly shekach pirush, that she's saying is, I'm going to take the teras kenim, I'm going to almost take it out of its context, because I want to use those same words to understand it according to traditional mikra. The teras kenim does not follow traditional mikra, like we explained before in Sif A. It doesn't work because if you just learn the Pashto Pshat that it's Har Sinai versus Oyel Moed, there's no proof that Shemitah was Bahar Sinai. And therefore you would need the words Bahar Sinai for Shemitah itself. You wouldn't have a proof for Shemitah to the other mitzvahs. And therefore, you have to change the Pshat in Teras Kehanim. So Pshuti Shel Mikra, which changes the Pshat of the Teras Kehanim, meaning to say, when you're learning what Teras Kehanim teaches according to Pshat Shel Mikra, it'll even fit according to Yishmael. In Teras Kehanim itself, it's like a following Rabbi Akiva. It has no reason to try to fit Rabbi Shmuel in. But according to Pshat Shel Mikra, we anyway have to learn it a little bit differently, and therefore it could work also according to Rabbi Shmuel. In Siftes, he's going to say that Ulay Shleimar, that it works even better according to Rabbi Shmuel. Not just that it works also according to Rabbi Shmuel. It's better according to Rabbi Shmuel's way. Ulay Shleimar, as Rashi learned, nor Kedas Rabbi Shmuel, let's brought him by Yilmeid, Ushinu L'Sheni Messina, and Shot Bahar Sinai, as Keishel Zain Bahar Sinai. You could even say that Rashi is following especially the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, that Pratim were in Oyel Moed. And when he says Sinai instead of Bahar Sinai, he's not saying Sinai in general either or, but he's actually negating Har Sinai. Because saying that would be more consistent with Pshat, which is the Derech from Pirshat Shel Torah, which is the approach of Rashi. In other words, till Sif Tes, you were saying that it could either be Bahar Sinai or Oyel Moed, as long as it's in Midbar Sinai. And therefore, it can go both according to Bishma, both according to Rabbi Akiva. And when Rashi says the words Sinai in Rashi and not Bahar Sinai, he's basically saying Midbar Sinai, which is inclusive of both. Now we're going to say that maybe it's possible to say that Rashi is specifically saying that it was not Bahar Sinai, not passively Bahar Sinai, but Dafke not Bahar Sinai, and Dafke Ba'Oyel Moed, and that approach works better according to Pshuto Shel Mikra, for two reasons. Aleph, late in Limud HaDerech HaPshat is mistaber, as Prati HaMitzvah seine gesagt geworden zu Eden, dort wo steht, dass sie befehlisch in Teire. According to Pshat, it's most sensible, most rational to say that the details of the mitzvahs were said wherever it says so in Torah. Und wie bald in Torah steht nicht als ich die Protim von alle mitzvahs. Seine gesagt geworden Bahar Sinai. And since the Torah never says that the details of all the mitzvahs were said Bahar Sinai, darf man haben a hechrech al derech HaPshat sagen also. You would need to have a compelling proof, according to Pshat, to say that the Protei HaMitzvahs were said in Har Sinai like Rabbi Akiva. And since we don't have that, therefore, it makes more sense to say that they were said by Oyel Moed, which is Pshuti Shel Mikra. The Rebbe learned Rashi as a chiddush from Limud for Teras Kehanim Kulum Chulum Sinai is nor as Aleph the mitzvahs on Arvis Moyav Beis and Gesing is not going to meet Sinai. The Rashi limits the chiddush. He's talking about only the mitzvahs that were in Chumash Dvarim, and the fact that they were said in Midbar Sinai, not in Har Sinai, because he can't go any further than what he has a proof for. And the only proof that he has is that it was not in Arvis Moyav. And therefore, he can only go that far. And to say that it was Klolos Upratos Bahar Sinai, like Rabbi Akiva, there's no proof for it, and therefore it makes more sense to say otherwise. Before we get to the second point, which is an even stronger point, this is in the negative, that there's no raya. Then in Beis is going to say there's a raya fakert, there's a raya to Rabbi Shmuel, which is number the second reason why Al Pi Terech HaPshat Rabbi Shmuel's shita is better. Before we get there, we're going to go, we're going to digress for a moment in the brackets. Late deras bar shita Rabbi Shmuel. Vert var entfert bederech umele was states this fact of Divrei Rabbi Akiva. According to this understanding in shita Rabbi Shmuel, that there's no raya al derech hapshat that it was said Bahar Sinai and therefore klolos upratus were said ba'Oyel Moed. This will explain a question that Tosfos asks in Rabbi Akiva. In the Gemara over there, Rabbi Shmuel said, "Klolos nemro Behar Sinai, upratos nemro b'Oyel Moed." Rabbi Akiva said, "Klolos upratos nemro Behar Sinai, v'nishnu b'Oyel Moed, v'nishtalshelu." They were repeated a third time in Arvis Moed. So Teisa says, "Vim Teimar." Excuse me. Why does Rabbi Akiva have to even mention Arvis Moed? Rabbi Shmuel didn't mention Arvis Moed. Rabbi Shmuel is not talking about Arvis Moed. He's talking about the Har Sinai versus Oyel Moed. So Rabbi Akiva should have answered back, Klolos upratos were Behar Sinai, and the Nishnu Oyel Moed. Why does Rabbi Akiva even mention Arvis Moed? In Tesis answers that it's relevant to the next statement of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, Tesis' answer is not relevant here. The question is what's relevant here. We have a question, why does Rabbi Akiva speak about Arvis Moed? Oh, but Alpia now is Oich Nishtalshelu B'Arvis Moed. Nishtalshu B'Arvis Moed Shaykh Tzir Plukta. This also fits into the Machlekes. Warum das Rabbi Shmuel Punkt 4 hat, dass die Protem seine nicht gesagt geworden bei Sinai, wie bald da steht nicht in Teire, also seien sie nicht gesagt geworden bei Arvis Moed. According to Rabbi Shmuel, just like he holds that they weren't said Behar Sinai, they were said B'Oyel Moed, because there's no raya that it was Arvis Moed, but there was no raya that it was Behar Sinai. He says the same thing about Arvis Moed, that it couldn't have been said by Arvis Moed because there's no raya that it was said by Arvis Moed. So in other words, Rabbi Shmuel is not just saying that it was nishtal, that it was repeated in Oyel Moed, and is abstaining from speaking about Arvis Moed. No, Rabbi Shmuel is saying it wasn't an Arvis Moed because it doesn't say anywhere that it was an Arvis Moed. And therefore he's saying that Dafka Pratos were Oyel Moed, because that's what's Masham P'Shul Mikra. So therefore Rabbi Akiva has to argue and say Nishtal Shuba Arvis Moed, because he's arguing with Rabbi Shmuel even on that. In other words, according to Rabbi Shmuel, any mitzvahs that were not mentioned in Arvis Moed, in Chumash, there's no raya that they were actually said there. Rabbi Akiva says everything was said in Arvis Moed. Klolos upratos was said once in Har Sinai, a second time in Oyel Moed, and the third time in Arvis Moed. Everything. Rabbi Shmuel has a whole different approach. Rabbi Shmuel says, I only know what I'm told. If it says to me it was Oyel Moed, then it was Oyel Moed. If it says in the Arvis Moed, then it was Arvis Moed. If it said Bar Sinai, it was Bar Sinai. But anything that wasn't said clearly where it was, all I know is Oyel Moed. That's the only thing we have a clear ayah for. So it comes out that Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva are arguing also with regards to Arvis Moed. And that's why Rabbi Akiva mentions it. That answers Tesis' question. And this is the chiddush of this seif. Because now that we're trying to understand Al Derech HaPshat, we're saying that we only follow that which we see in Chumash. And if there's no raya to something in Chumash, we don't accept it at face value. Number Beis, going back to our Aleph and Beis over here, where we were trying to understand the fact that according to Pshuto Shel Mikra, the Derech HaPshat, in other words, is that the mitzvahs where Klolos was Taka Bar Sinai, but Pratus was B'Oyel Moed. Beis V'Ikir. Here's another raya. Klolos von Shmita is gesagt geworden, if noch kedem Sivei HaMishkan von Bar Sinai. The general rules of Shemitah were said by Har Sinai, like it says in Parshas Mishpatim, V'Sheishanim Tizra V'Geima V'Shvius Tishmetena, which is the first time Shemitah is mentioned, which is mentioned in general. But Parshas Seinu, when it says Ven B'Oyel Moed, comes to Pratus. But Parshas Seinu, which is in Oyel Moed, at least according to the way we understand the Sikha, we understand Rashi that Har Sinai means B'Oyel Moed. That's when the Pratim come. But that's Machliel, Derech HaPshat, that's Klolos B'Sinai Pratus B'Oyel Moed. So we see here clearly, according to Pshuto Shel Mikra, that the general mitzvah was said in Har Sinai, and the Pratus was said B'Oyel Moed. So there's no reason to go otherwise. So Sif Tes, he was mechadish. That not only is the Teras Rashi telling us that the mitzvahs that were B'Arvis Moed were started out b'Sinai, which is either Har Sinai or Oyel Moed, which is what we were saying till now, and therefore it could follow either Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Yishmael. So he says no. He says, according this is Siftes, that Rashi holds that it was Dafke B'Oyel Moed and not Bar Sinai. Because first of all, there's no raya that it was Bar Sinai. Second of all, the raya that we have is that it was Taka B'Oyel Moed. That's what happens in Shemitah. You see the Klolos was said by Har Sinai, and the Pratus was by Moed. So therefore, we if we're going to follow Pshuto Shel Mikra, it follows much closer according to Rabbi Shmuel and Dafka, not according to Rabbi Akiva. So we started out in the beginning of the Sikha that Rashi was siding with Rabbi Akiva, or that this Teres Kerenim was siding with Rabbi Akiva against Rabbi Shmuel. Then the second version was that it was both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel, and the third version is that it's leaning more to Rabbi Shmuel and not like Rabbi Akiva. Sif Yud. Now we're going to go into the Chassidus. Is the canal Mer Mas Rabbi Shmuel. Even though according to Pshutas Mikra we follow, it's more consistent with the Shita of Rabbi Shmuel. Is Abal Derech Halacha, the Din with Rabbi Akiva, and we have the Kal Halacha Rabbi Akiva Mechavede. According to Halacha, we follow the Shita of Rabbi Akiva. Das verstehen wir Akten wir Machlekes zwischen Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. We'll understand that if Pshutas Mikra is Rabbi Shmuel, why is the Halacha according to Rabbi Akiva? That way I'll understand by first explaining the machlekes of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel according to Pnimis Yonim. The chilek zwischen Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, wie schön gerät viel mal. The difference between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, and this is discussed in other places in the Likutei Sichos as well, even in one of the Sichos that we had last year in Chelek and Aleph. Rabbi Shmuel is ben Akein Gadol, und seine Aveda ist gewähnt in dem Eifen von Vayavdel, Geimar Kedesh HaKadoshim, Aveda Tzadikim. Rabbi Shmuel was a Akein Gadol, and his Aveda was the Aveda of Tzadikim. Rabbi Akiva is ben Gedim, was an Aveda is given the Eifen from Aveda Sabal Yeshuva. Rabbi Akiva was a descendant of Gedim, therefore his Aveda was, or some say he himself was a Ger, and therefore his Aveda was the Aveda of Baal Tshuva. Das ist was Rabbi Akiva had gesagt, Kol Yomai Yisi Mitztar Chulu Masi Aveda Divakemenu. This explains that Rabbi Akiva who would say, all my days, my whole life, I was pained. I used to ask, when will I have the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of Mesiras Nefesh? It is gestanden not nur from Mesiras Nefesh. Rabbi Akiva was constantly in a state of Mesiras Nefesh. Not just by Krishma, by the word Echad, which is when a person is supposed to be Limsa Nafesh Be'echad, when a person is supposed to be ready to be Mesiras Nefesh for the Echad, for the Achdus Hashem, but Kol Yamai. It was his whole day, in all of his days. Rabbi Akiva was constantly in a state of Mesiras Nefesh. Mitzad, Tzadikim was ben Abba Mesiras Nefesh B'chil Zayeh, B'shas Krishma. When you're coming from the approach of it, Tzadikim, then in the beginning of the day, you have Mesiras Nefesh. You say Krishma in the beginning of the day, and you have to be ready to give up your life, either literally or figuratively, for the Eivishter. Ober Kol HaYom is the Aveda B'Seder V'Adraga. A whole day you have to have a more orderly, structured day. The ratio from Mesiras Nefesh of Takazayim Bekim Kol Torah Mitzvahs, you have to have an impact of the Mesiras Nefesh on the rest of the day in Torah Mitzvahs. But in Vas Tutman, in the Torah Mitzvahs, but the rest of the day is in a day when you learn Torah, you do mitzvahs in the structured, systematic way that you're supposed to do it. But tshuva is a beyond structure, it's above structure, it's above the orderly and the order and constraints. Steht und ständig. Seivim in learn Torah, und wenn es bekam mitzvahs, na viele wenn es essen mit dividu shush na Mesiras Nefesh. The Aveda of a tzaddik is a structured Aveda. There's a time for davening, a time for learning. There's even a time for limsa nafshi bechad for Mesiras Nefesh. But the Aveda of tshuva, it can't be limited to this structure. And therefore, you're constantly in a side when you're learning Torah, side when you're doing mitzvahs, and even when you're involved in mundane matters, you're constantly in a state of Mesiras Nefesh. Und das means Kol Yomai. That's what Rabbi Akiva means Kol Yomai. In alle seine Inyanim is gestartet in Natur from Mesiras Nefesh. In all of his endeavors, he was always in a state of Mesiras Nefesh. Because he was a Ben Gedim, he means to say he was engaged in the Aveda about Tshuva. Aveda's Tshuva is beyond structure, and therefore, in all good times, in all situations, he was always in a state of Mesiras Nefesh. Und das ist der Tama Machlekes, as Rabbi Shmuel halt es Kol Misina Pretzem Yomeid, und Rabbi Akiva halt es Kol Pretzem Misina. This explains the reasoning of the Machlekes, that Rabbi Akiva holds that the details of the mitzvahs were also Misinai, and Rabbi Shmuel holds that the details of the mitzvahs were by Yomeid. The Chilek between Sinai and Yomeid, the difference between Sinai and Yomeid. Yomeid they got a seder. Yomeid was structured. It said like when in the Mechitzis, Yiriyas, Ukrashim, there were separations. Walls, in other words, there were the curtains that covered the top. There was the panels that made up the walls. As then mit Shuyer in the Tzir from Seder Ishtalshalus, Kibir Aramo and Sefer Torah Sa'ila. It was designed according to the design of Seder Ishtalshalus. This is how the Ramah explains it in the Sefer Torah Sa'ila. Torah Sa'ila is a sefer that's I don't know if it's called a Kabbalah sefer, but it's a sefer that is more mystical, a sefer written by the Ramah. in the Sicha of Yud Kislev Tavshin Zayin, I printed it out over here. It says der Oifin Binyan Beis Elamim, the way the Beis Hamikdash was built, was Shleimat Geboit al Pi Achanas Vedas David in Yerushalayim. Was der Mikdash, was is in Yerushalayim Shalamata, is Mechuven to Beis Hamikdash, was says Yerushalayim Shalamayla. That the Mikdash down here was parallel, was consistent with the Beis Hamikdash above. And then he says, Agoyin HaMekubal HaRav Ramah Rabbeinu Moshe Ba'agoyin Rabbi Yisrael Isalis Mikmisalish Mikrako in sein Sefer Teras Ha'ela is Mevair Uisfirlich. He explains clearly the alle Protein Yonah von der Beis Hamikdash Shalamata und dem Beis Hamikdash in Elam Esel Yenim in Elam HaTachnen und in Keches und Midas B'nei Adam. He explains the Beis Hamikdash above, the Beis Hamikdash below, how it applies to this world, and how it applies to the person's kaiches and midas, which are based on Seder HaIshtalshalos. So we see that the Beis Hamikdash, the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash were built in a layout that had a specific structure. It had to fit into a certain structure. This is the Aveda of Seder V'Adraga, of orderliness and step by step. There was taka true. There was keteiros usually refers to the aveda that's beyond seder v'adraga. So much so that once a year the Kohen Gadol would even go into the Kedesh HaKadoshim. But nevertheless, this is taka just once a year. Just like once a day you have to have Mesiris Nefesh by Krishma. The Kohen Gadol Alein is an Kedesh HaKadoshim. This was only the Kohen Gadol, not the rest of the Yidden. So there is an aspect of the Kohen Gadol that exists by every Yid. There's a certain part of a Yid that is on a higher level, but generally speaking, all the other days of the year, the Kohen Gadol did not go into the Kedesh HaKadoshim. Just like a regular Yid, all the rest of the time, besides for Shema, Kriya Shema, and Mesiris Nefesh, is engaged in regular Aveda. So the Oyel Mayid represents an Aveda, a structured, orderly, step-by-step Aveda. Sinai is going to Midbar. Sinai was a desert. Nitkinot, when you say they're not a place of habitation or of order. But das weißt der Aveda von Hecher, wie der Vadrage. This represents the Aveda that's beyond structure. This is why we find that the Gemara in Shabbos says that every single dibur that the Eibusher spoke, the neshama flew out of them. Their guf could not contain the energy, the fire of the dibur, and the neshama left the body. The dibur is the discipline of Avodah Zarah. If you talk about these are major fundamental mitzvahs, for which a person has to have Mesiris Nefesh. So I can understand why it was Parcha Nishmasam, why the Neshama went out, because you're demanding from a person on Neshama Beguf Mesiris Nefesh, Aveda that doesn't fit into the structure of a person. So just Nishmasam. B'shas says wegen Kavitz Levicha leisigne v'kayitz bezeh. Was ze seine von die Mitzvah sichlies, Aveda soll betam vadas, is was for Shaychas haben ze mit Yitzas Nishmasam. But if you talk about the other mitzvahs, such as Kibbud Avim or leisigne, these are very sensible mitzvahs. So why would the neshama fly out for these mitzvahs? But the fact is that it was being given, even though the mitzvah themselves make sense, but they were being given in Sinai, which is a mitzvah d'kedusha, an earth from in a place that's beyond structure, beyond the orderliness. The dibur is called dibur me'ar Sinai g'mesiris nefesh. And therefore, every single dibur, if it came from our Sinai, it brought about Mesiris Nefesh. Ständig. Was Zoltan, how to Mesiris Nefesh. Just like said Rabbi Akiva that anything that he did was Mesiris Nefesh, so to by the Yidden, any mitzvah, if it was coming from Sinai, it's Mesiris Nefesh. And Yatson is Masan. So let's just make sure we're holding on here. Rabbi Shmuel is Aveda Tzadikim, which is Aveda B'Seder V'Adraga. Rabbi Akiva is Avedas HaTshuva, Bali Tshuva, Avedas HaTshuva, which is the man of Seder V'Adraga. Oyel Mayid represents Seder V'Adraga. Midbar represents L'mayim of Seder V'Adraga. So now let's bring the two together. Das is Plukdasim Shal Rabbi Yishmael v'Rabbi Akiva. Beside it, it's a tzadikim Rabbi Yishmael is genug v'skol Yisrael Messina. According to Rabbi Shmuel, when you're coming from the perspective of tzaddikim, it's enough that that the general mitzvah came from Sinai. B'shasman, meaning to say that the general mitzvah should have a concept of Mesiras Nefesh, should have a concept of ligvul, of B'shasman, that's the vegani mitzvahs. But the klal, takiyah, the mitzvah zunder, aber the mitzvah guf blazer klal. If you're talking about the mitzvahs as a general rule, the basis of the mitzvah, the says minat vegani yesod mitzvah, you're discussing the foundation of the mitzvah. Therefore, Sinai, it has to come with Mesiras Nefesh. The foundation of every single mitzvah, even according to Rabbi Shmuel, is Mesiras Nefesh. But according to Rabbi Shmuel, if you're discussing the detail of the mitzvah, the implementation of the mitzvah, as you're doing, fulfilling each specific mitzvah, that has to be a Mesudah de Kaved, the Aved Veil Moed. Therefore, Rabbi Shmuel holds that Kol Yisrael Misinai uPratiseh Veil Moed. Rabbi Akiva aber Aved Satshuva sagt. But Rabbi Akiva is coming from the perspective of Aved Satshuva. He says, Aleph. Mitzad dem, was man hat zu tun mit den Yonim, was man da sein mit Geier sein, ben Gedim, muss man ankommen zu Mesiras Nefesh, b'shas ha'snezach v'gim. Here, there's a situation of Gedim. We're trying to transform the world. We're fighting against the world. We need Mesiras Nefesh. Even for the Pratei mitzvahs. Even the implementation of the mitzvah is not just taking another step. We're fighting the world. And therefore we need Mesiras Nefesh. And therefore we need even Protesea should come from Sinai. Beis mitzadem was bei Städten der nur von Jerusalem we say there can men euch bei Protea kol hat Mesiras Nefesh. From another way of looking at it, because we're coming from a perspective of tshuva, it's possible that even the Pratei mitzvahs can be done with Mesiras Nefesh. When you're tzaddikim, when you're actually doing the mitzvah, when you're eating matzah, you're focusing on the matzah. You're doing the mitzvah. When you're coming from a perspective of tshuva, even eating matzah is done with Mesiras Nefesh. Everything is Mesiras Nefesh because there's no seder. You're not meaning to say you're above seder. You're meaning to say that you are coming to change the world, to transform the world. For this, you need to be able to go all out. You can't follow the Seder Hadrag. So this is the Machlekes, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shmuel says, Kol Yisrael Misinai, the Yesod of every mitzvah is Misinai, but Yisrael is Be'il Moed. Once you get to the practice of the mitzvah, it has to be done B'Seder Mesudar. Rabbi Akiva says, no. Rabbi Akiva says, we're coming from a perspective of Mitzvah Tshuva. There's no such thing as Seder Hadrag. Everything is L'mayla Seder Hadrag. Everything that we do is with Mesiras Nefesh. Because we're Ben Gedim, we're fighting the world. And therefore, even a regular mitzvah is, even the prat of the mitzvah, the implementation of the actual mitzvah is Misinai with Mesiras Nefesh. Das is the beer was in that limit to make a learn Rashi Rabbi Shmuel. But that's because the halacha Rabbi Akiva. Now let's finish up the final word. This is why it's going to come out that according to Rabbi Shmuel, Shmuel fits in better with traditional mikra, but Rabbi Akiva fits better with halacha. When you're coming from the perspective of Teira, and Teira speaks to the majority, which the majority we're talking to tzaddikim, is the Teira as placed in Teira, which is coming from the perspective of Teira, which sees every Yid as a tzaddik. So therefore you follow Rabbi Shmuel's approach. That because as a tzaddik, it's okay for Prateseh to be from Eil Mayit. Oh, when you're talking about halacha, which is how you have to bring it down into the world, since you're involved with the world, with the Jinyanim Gashmim and Allah has come of a camo. Bisman Golus was God, Allah is vestadim, especially when you're talking about Golus, when the Allah is vestadim, when the concealments are so great, then we have to come to a level of intensity with regards to the birur, the minyan tshuva, which is the idea of tshuva. You can't go step by step, deal with it slowly but surely, but you have to come all out. With Mesiras Nefesh, with the extreme, is halacha Rabbi Akiva. Then when you're dealing with olam, with halacha, then you have to go Rabbi Akiva as eichdi prat and darfas misina, that even the details have to also be misina as bechol inyan ve'inyan kol yoma, in every aspect, in every element. Therefore, ständig stehen nur from Mesiras Nefesh, you have to constantly be in a state of Mesiras Nefesh, because only then could you fight the world and fight the golus and transform the world, that it should become ready for the Geula.